is everybody here who wants to take the seminar? Shall we start?
Voluntarily.
Yeah.
Huh? Okay. So the idea is, and Tatiana and I discussed that, I want to talk to you about a dimension in the humanities that has been present a long time, but I think that has been underestimated, and that I find is quite interesting. And that dimension is mood, atmosphere. In English, mood or atmosphere, and in German the word is Stimmung, and I will actually use the German word a lot because I think for random reasons that is not always the case. This German word has a semantic complexity that's much higher than atmosphere, mood, and this is why I try to develop this concept of Stimmung. I have a book that's translated in a couple of languages. In English it is mood, atmosphere, Stimmung, and it also exists in German. In German the title is Stimmungen lesen, it exists in Spanish and it exists in Portuguese, but I mean, whatever. I will try, I mean, has anybody ever read this book? No, I mean, I expect that you have not read the book, but if ever that would be a problem for me. So, and yet I try not to just repeat that book. I mean, I try to tell you a little bit where I'm with this reflection.
We read this introductory article.
I know.
And about Janis Joplin.
Yeah.
And about Janis Joplin, yeah, of course, yeah, we had agreed on that. But anyway, I mean, I'll come back to a couple of points, but I'll definitely not repeat it. So, let me say that the first intuition to work on this concept, it was actually originally, what is the book now, was a series of experimental short essays published in a daily newspaper, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which is a little bit comparable in the German context, the New York Times in the English context, and the American context, or to the Manchester Guardian or whatever. So it was a series of short essays, but the basic intuition had to do with literature. In literature, in literary studies, especially in America, there is an expression like reading for the plot. Reading for the plot. So if you read for the plot, you read for the action, you read like you read a police novel, in a way that you want to find out who was the murderer at the end. Or you want to find out, as my mother was always saying, will they get each other at the end? So will this love story be fulfilled? And it is my impression that, and I will give you one example in a second, that in many literary texts actually, the plot, this question, reading for the plot, is a structural vehicle that makes it possible for a text to allow you to immerse yourself into a Stimmung. That, I mean, the example I'm giving, I think also in the introduction of the book, is Thomas Mann's Death in Venice. I mean, only my mother was the only person whom I ever heard asking, kriegen die sich am Ende? Will they become a couple at the end? I mean, it's very clear in a novel from 1904 that a pedophile relationship will not be fulfilled at the end. I mean, so you don't read Death in Venice in order to find out about that relationship. You read Death in Venice because you get a kick, you find it interesting to immerse yourself, as Thomas Mann is making it possible, into that world of Venice in the early 20th century, also into a certain erotic situation that is no longer given in the year 2016. I basically think that this dimension of Stimmung also allows literary studies to a certain degree to get out of a binarism. I normally don't have anything against binarisms, that has turned out not to be fruitful, and that is a binarism between a realistic reading. So ultimately that would be the Marxist approach, for example. What literature allows you is a different view on certain social realities of their times. That would be ultimately also what somebody like Georg Lukács pretends to do, whom both Sasha and I like a lot. On the other hand, the opposite position where you say, no, literature in reality never has anything to do with reality. And you could go so far as the Belgian literary theorist Paul de Man to say, all that literature ever tells you is to warn you that there is no realism in literature. I mean, I think at a certain point, this tension between these two positions that are both right and wrong at the same time had become completely fruitless. So in that sense, I had the idea and ambition that reading for the atmosphere, the mood, reading for the Stimmung, could be a productive, not alternative, a productive third dimension. Okay, so this is how I got into this. Now, I want to say, however, that my interest in the dimension of Stimmung has not remained being, in the first place, literary studies interest. Yeah? I'm actually interested in this dimension of Stimmung in a philosophical rather than psychological way. You could even say, because you like the word, in an anthropological way. So what I want to do with you, I want to come back to this description that you know from the introduction of Atmosphere, Mood, Stimmung, and add a couple of perspectives that I didn't have when I was writing that book to make it a little bit more complex. Then in the second place, I want to come back to some of the highlights of this conceptual history of Stimmung. I mean, that you also find in the book, but I can see it in a different way now. And in the third part, I want to discuss two sets of examples that I didn't discuss in the book. One set would be what we consider to be the greatest Western novels of the 20th century. I think they are, almost without exception, all about reading for Stimmung, about immersion much rather than plot. And I will finally try, and this will be an open question, not to focus again on Janis Joplin, whom I continue to dearly love, but I'll focus on a new love, and that's Adele. Yeah? I mean, you all know this singer Adele, whether you like her or not. I mean, that I admit here that I like Adele so much shows you that I'm not very sophisticated about music, which is certainly true. I'm not. So, I have actually, instead of 7 dimensions of the, as you've seen in the lecture, I'm a decimal fetishist, I was saying I've shown so many points. So I have 7 points about this concept of Stimmung, and I'm just using the word Stimmung because, I mean, Stimmung meaning voiceness, Stimme in German is voice, and the ending UNG would be something like ness. I mean, that word doesn't exist in English, voiceness, but that would be a translation. So, in the first place, and as you've read in the introduction, I'm proposing, this is in a way a proposal for a definition, that whenever we talk about Stimmung, we talk about something that was triggered by a modality of the lightest possible touch of our material environment on our body. What do I mean by the lightest possible touch? I mean, for example, light, yeah? Or I mean the weather, or I mean my voice. Yeah? As you all know, light impacts us as a in a full body way. So does the weather. I mean, we're always immersed in weather, and so does my voice. I mean, one thing is that you are listening to me, I hope, and trying to understand, to attribute meaning to the sound waves that I'm producing. But at the same time, while you're doing that with your ears and with your inner ears, my voice is a full body experience for you. My voice, so to speak, grabs your bodies. And if the voice was a different voice, I mean, had a different tonality, had a different pronunciation in English, it would hit your body in a different way. So, I mean, I'm not saying that voice, weather, music are the only modalities that trigger Stimmung, but I'm saying whenever I talk about Stimmung, I talk about a psychic state that is triggered by the lightest possible touch of our material environment on our body. Is that clear? And secondly, you also find that in the book we all have the experience that these lightest possible touches of the material world on our body produce certain psychic states. Yeah? I mean, I come back to this very, very beautiful description of the American Nobel laureate Toni Morrison from her novel Jazz, which is largely not exclusively about jazz, about the music. And she describes moods as, quote unquote, this is as if being touched from inside, as if being touched from inside. That's of course a paradox. I mean, you cannot physically touch somebody from inside. So I think this metaphor combines the physicality of this impact of the outside environment on your body, being touched, that changes something in your psyche, yeah? That changes your psychic state. So like being touched from inside. I mean, if it was only the lightest physical touch, it would not be worth mentioning. It is worth mentioning because we realize that those lightest physical touches can affect our, well, I say psyche, our mind, in the largest possible way. Is that clear so far? Okay, now I want to add something that is not really developed in the book. There are, of course, I mean, once again, we all know that regularities. There are regularities. I'm not quite sure about regularities that are really meta-historical and transcultural, but let me suppose that the lack of light or cold weather are very generally something that contributes to a negative psychic state. Yeah? I mean, we do know that the suicide rates go up enormously in Scandinavian countries during the winter. Yeah? Nevertheless, the world leader in suicides is Hungary. Nobody knows why, and has been for 200 years. But nevertheless, I mean, that should be a general law. On the other hand, I think there are lots of regularities about Stimmungen that are very individual. Yeah, I mean, everybody asks me, why do you not stay with a coat in Minsk when it is so cold, and will you not catch death, not only a cold? I mean, for some reason, and with limits, I like being exposed to very cold weather. Yeah, I like this feeling of being, it's almost too much, like when we had this beautiful walk this afternoon. I really like that. I don't think that I'm the only person on the planet who has that, but this is rather individual. I mean, it works with me, it could change in my life, but I cannot remember any stage of my life when this was not the case. I mean, it could change in the future, but you all have, so this is not general. One cannot say everybody likes cold days in Minsk, yeah? But I happen to like cold days wherever, and I very intentionally don't wear a heavy coat because I like that. I also like gray November days. It's about the only thing, cold days and gray November days, that I'm missing in California. I love to live in California. I could no longer live without the luminosity of California, which sometimes is very, very strong. Some people don't like it. But okay, we all know we have such individual things. In between are Stimmungen that are historically specific. I don't know whether any of you has ever heard from the context of the history of English literature of the Lake District. In the 18th century, this was in the British Midlands, between today Manchester and Leeds. So there's a region with lakes and mountains, and this is really, one could say, the landscape that triggered English Romantic poetry. Today that landscape in the first place looks very different, and secondly, I doubt, you know, given our very different life today, I mean, we travel more, etc., that today this landscape could trigger any poetic movement. But it did in the 18th century. So the point I want to make there is, here is a Stimmung, in the sense of Toni Morrison, like being touched from inside, that is historically specific. That is historically specific. Even another example, have you ever heard about a book by the Spanish philosopher, not a great philosopher, I think, but Miguel de Unamuno, Del sentimiento trágico de la vida, on the tragic feeling of life. Yeah. This is a very self-indulgent book about the tragic feeling. This is somebody who loves to feel tragic, And this book was the best-selling intellectual book in Europe in the second decade of the 20th century. I absolutely bet if that book was published today, nobody would ever buy it. I mean, the few people who read it today read it by obligation because it's a classic of Spanish intellectual and literary history. So get my point, I don't want to go any further. It is not quite easy to describe the regularities about Stimmung. Yeah? There are regularities, I mean, there are very few meta-historical regularities. There are very clear individual regularities, there are historical regularities, but I mean, you know, I will not spend my lifetime making this differentiation, but it is relatively difficult. Yeah, I mean, I give you one final, because it has to do with Thomas Mann again, and I don't like Thomas Mann actually, but remember when, I mean, who has read Death in Venice? Okay, remember it starts with a specific weather in Munich, and that weather is called Föhn, and it has to do with a pre-Alpine geographical situation in Munich. Until the present day, when in Munich is Föhn, the number of traffic accidents goes up by more than 2 times.
For pedestrians, they in these places are just a movement of people, just pedestrians.
Yeah, but not everybody. But I want to say not everybody is really affected by it.
It looks like an artificial environment. It looks like artificial environment.
Artificial. No, the Föhn is not artificial. This is just the weather that happens, and when that happens in Munich specifically, where I spent not a large part, but a certain part of my life, I mean, 9 out of 10 people are ill-humored. Lots of taxi drivers don't drive taxi because they feel it's actually dangerous. They have an accident and then they lose their license, and so forth and so forth. Not everybody. I mean, I was lucky enough I was not sensitive to Föhn. I mean, I didn't even notice it. I mean, I could tell from how people behaved. It's also a certain type of light, but you get my point. So, I mean, there are very few absolute regularities. My fourth point is that we also associate in German Stimmung with the verb stimmen. And the verb stimmen is to tune an instrument. You tune an instrument, so you can do this fine tuning, and there is a certain expectation that Stimmungen, this is actually something that Kant believed, that Schiller believed, that Stimmungen are a way to mediate between the rational side and the more emotional side of our mind. Yeah? So I think this is, I mean, Kant actually is using in the third critique, in those chapters that nobody reads, after the description of the aesthetic judgment, I mean, most people just read that and not much more. There's a very long passage, much longer than what he writes about aesthetic judgment, on Stimmungen and on this capacity to mediate. I think this is also a reality in many cases. The fifth one, and then I start with a couple of descriptions that are not in the book. The fifth one is this German phrase, das stimmt. Anybody knew Portuguese, you say in Portuguese, é certo. And I'm referring to, there's an immediate, almost epiphanic qualities to Stimmung. Yeah? I mean, for example, you probably all have your favorite music. I mean, in my case, it continues to be me and Bobby McGee. Now, not each time that I listen to me and Bobby McGee, I get into the mood, I get into the Stimmung. But when it happens, I absolutely know it. I also absolutely know it when it doesn't happen. Yeah? Or sometimes you like a piece of music and you hear it from afar, and it has this epiphanic quality. You cannot not engage with it. Yeah? So I think there's a certain, you know what I mean by epiphanic? I mean a certain type, a certain quality of evidence that is related to Stimmung. Okay. Now the next point I want to mention, and I think this is point number 6, is that I believe that Stimmungen are related to what you can call latency. Yeah? By latency, I mean latent is the verb. It comes from the Latin word latere, and that means to be hidden. Something is hidden. Now, when we talk about a latency, something is latent, we talk about a strange paradoxical situation. We talk about a situation in which we have certainty that something is there, as one would say in American English, that something is there, without knowing where that thing is, nor knowing what that thing is. You get the point? I mean, that something is there that influences me, that has an impact on me, but I don't know where it is, because if I knew where it is, I would maybe go there and remove it. I don't even know what it is, namely that if that thing or that face showed itself to me all of a sudden, I would not necessarily know that it is that thing which was latent. Yeah? Is that clear? That has a relationship, and this is why people often talk about latency as stowaway. You know what a stowaway is? A clandestine passenger. Yeah. How many people among you have seen the film Titanic? Yeah. So there are clandestine passenger stowaways in Titanic. Yeah. Leo DiCaprio I don't remember the name of the protagonist. And everybody on the ship feels somehow that they are there, that something strange is going on. But then there's a party and they dress up the stowaways and nobody knows that they are the stowaways. You get my point? So in the Stimmung of latency, when that which is latent shows itself, you do not necessarily know that it is that which is latent because you don't know what it is. You do not only not know where it is, you do also not know what it is. Yeah? Now, here's my point. But if we don't know what it is that is latent and we don't know where it is, how do we know that there's something latent? I think we know by Stimmung. I mean, when we say there's something in the air, there's something in the air, then we refer to such situations of latency. So what I'm saying is, that's my sixth point, that oftentimes Stimmungen have a hermeneutic potential. Yeah? I mean, not a hermeneutic potential for reading a text, but a hermeneutic potential in our everyday. So, yeah, there's something in the air, and if there's something in the air, you start wondering what that might be. Yeah? So I'm not saying that whenever something is latent, there has to be a Stimmung. It's not a necessary relationship, but oftentimes, in situations of latency, a Stimmung is emerging. And I'm also not saying that whenever we have a Stimmung that indicates a latency, that Stimmung will ultimately lead us to the identification of what is latent. Like whenever in Freud you read about a trauma and a neurosis, you can be absolutely surely and safely assume that at the end of the case story, Freud will tell you what was latent. I mean, like in the Krankengeschichte des kleinen Hans, this is this little boy that always faints when he sees animals, and at the end you realize this was because he thought, I mean, this is ironically saying, he thought that his daddy was a horse. And then Dr. Freud tells him your daddy was not really a horse, and then the symptom disappears. That is not the case with situations of latency. I mean, very often we have a feeling that there's something in the air, and that feeling never goes. Or sometimes we have a feeling that something is in the air, and that feeling goes, but we don't know why. It is not because we have identified what it is. Is that clear? So I do think that there is a systematic relationship, no, not a systematic relationship. There's a frequent relationship between situations and latency and Stimmung, but it is not a necessary relationship. And it is also not a relationship that promises a solution. It can help to find a solution. It can help to identify what is latent, but it's not a promise. Is that clear? In a second, you can see that in general, Stimmung is a phenomenon that is complex and relatively fuzzy. I mean, by fuzzy we mean it's very difficult to circumscribe. Yeah? It's very difficult to say black or white, one or two. I mean, like in this case, it has a regularity, but not a well circumscribed regularity. It has an association with latency, but not a necessary association with latency. Okay.
Can you please explain in which way Stimmung and latence are separated?
I mean, when you talk of latency, you talk about a situation in which something is hidden. I mean, something is removed. I'm saying that oftentimes you have this certainty that something is there but hidden due to a Stimmung. Yeah, so the Stimmung is not synonymous. I mean, there's an overlap, but the Stimmung is not synonymous with the situation of latency. Complex and complex in the sense of the humanities making the world more complex, and beautiful and yet not completely satisfying description of that is a reflection, a fragment by the German poet Friedrich Hölderlin on the change of tones in poetry. So Hölderlin believes that certain poetic forms trigger certain moods. I mean, he's not using the word Stimmung, but that's clearly what he's doing. And I think this is a phenomenon that you've all experienced. You know? I mean that you listen to a description of something or narration in a ballad, and that ballad has a certain prosodic form, and depending on the prosodic form, it puts you in a different mood. And I think it is one of those phenomena that I was talking about when I was talking about regularities. I think so a verse form that fascinates me, I don't know whether I can associate, is this 12-syllable verse of French classical drama called Alexandrin. Yeah, for most people this is very heavy, and it gets them into the mood of something august, something, as you would say in German, feierlich, something very official. Yeah? It doesn't have to be the case with everybody, but I don't think it is a verse form that gets everybody into an erotic mood, or that gets everybody thinking much. I mean, it has this very monumental heaviness. And I would also say that part of the fascination of the Stimmung triggered by prosody, triggered by poetic forms, I mean verse form, rhyme form, and so forth, has to do with the feeling that prosody makes parts of our body resonate that are not consciousness. Yeah? I mean, when you listen to prosody, you know, you oftentimes, like when you listen to music, you feel inclined to move your body. And in that sense, I think oftentimes prosody, in addition to this feeling of a certain tonality of prosody, so that makes you happy and that makes you feel august or whatever, that prosody has this function and quality, metaphorically speaking, to give us back our existential roots, so to speak, that give us back to the material world in which we feel that we have a body and are being part of the material world. Okay, this is what I wanted to add and say in terms of a phenomenological description of Stimmung. I mean, that I have now 6 or 7 points instead of originally 4 doesn't mean I have now solved the problem. I'm making it more complex, right? I mean, so for today, I went back to the phenomenon of Stimmung that I had already worked upon, and all of a sudden I said, oh, I have 3 more descriptive features that I find interesting in Stimmung. Now, at this point, I mean, are you all following, or as this is a seminar, I just shouldn't speak for another 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Shall we hit the break here and have a short discussion, and then I move on? Whatever you want. Huh?
Not to make it too monolith.
Exactly. Yeah. Especially because I love talking, so it makes it all the more dangerous.
So you have to be stopped.
Yes. And I stopped myself, which is very heroic. Yeah. Okay.
May we refer to some places in your text?
Sure, whatever you want to do. Yeah.
Once or twice in this text you formulate thesis or about connection between Stimmung and alterity, Andersheit. Yeah. Could you clarify a little bit this thesis that in a way when one is attuned by tone, by music, we have a very particular experience, and it's experience of the alterity, Andersheit. It's not really developed in this small text. Could you clarify a little bit this?
Can you tell me where it is? In the Walde von der Vogelweide, for example.
In introductory, this.
In the introductory reading, I mean.
This experience of alterity.
No, that's otherness or alterity.
Otherness, yeah.
That's well, alterity is equally good. I'm grading the question again, but it's more interesting than I thought, because you could of course say if Stimmung is a phenomenon of immersion, then something that's completely alien to you cannot be a Stimmung. I mean, maybe I would at this point say what can work in this sense is the following, and this is in the chapter of the book, if you have this book on this medieval German troubadour, Walter von der Vogelweide. Yeah? I mean, Walter von der Vogelweide, for all we know, of course he didn't write down his own text. It was from the late 12th century. The text got written down in the early 15th century or something like that. But Walter von der Vogelweide was a master of prosody. Yeah? He had a broad variety of prosody. And he was also, like quite a number of 12th and 13th century troubadours, he was involved in the fights for power in Europe. Yeah? I mean, there were two candidates for the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire of Germanation, for what was the emperor, and he was between them. And when he talks about that in his songs, in his poems, especially when you recite these poems and realize that the prosody doesn't quite work, you get an impression that there's somebody nervous. Yeah? Now, that would be a Stimmung, but the excitement of the Stimmung would precisely not be in its otherness, but A, in its chronological distance, and B, in the fact that in spite of this chronological distance, you feel the immediacy of something that is in reality 800 years away. I'll give you another example. I don't know whether anybody knows it. If not, I recommend it very strongly, and this is Fragment 34 by Sappho. Fragment 34 by Sappho, like most very ancient, Sappho is early 7th century BC. And this fragment 34 is something that sociologists would call a scene of triangulation. So the lyrical I, the first person I, whom we would say is lesbian, that is more than complicated, but okay, let's say, this lyrical I is lesbian, and she sees a very beautiful young girl being flirtatious with a very good-looking man. Yeah, so this is the triangular situation. For those among you who know this author, like René Girard, my former Stanford colleague, has been describing. Yeah, not everybody knows Girard. Either people have him as love of their lives or they hate him. I liked him a lot. He was a very good colleague. Anyway, it's a situation of triangulation, but I don't even want to talk about that. The amazing thing is, when you read this fragment 34, and it's really an amazing, amazing text, you have a high probability that you immediately feel this erotic situation. You immediately feel this jealousy, you immediately feel the erotic tension that is quote unquote in the air, and you get such a kick out of it. It's so interesting. I love these situations because it is almost 3,000 years back in that case. So these are cases that I know, but I feel it is maybe very, very difficult, if not impossible, to get into a Stimmung. I mean, just trying to work that out, I haven't thought about it, to get into a Stimmung that is too alien for you, too much of an otherness for you. Yeah, I mean, we all know these situations. I mean, I spent this past summer in India teaching, and so I'm fascinated by Hinduism. And if I go into Hindu temples, I feel I can get something. I mean, it's remote from a remote world, but between the smell, the darkness, the multiplicity of sculptures, and so forth, I think I understand something. But there are other cultures. I mean, for me, to a certain extent, Islamic culture, where I don't get. I mean, I can describe the otherness. I can describe it with concepts, but I don't get myself into a psychic inclination to be part of the situation. But no, I mean, if you want to insist, I don't know whether this is a definitive answer, but for me, I mean, what I could associate with otherness is precisely this chronological remoteness, where a Stimmung seems to bridge or to neutralize this remoteness. Yeah? I mean, like, you really, when you recite this these few Walter von der Vogelweide songs, where he doesn't hit the prosodies, oh my God, this guy's really, really nervous. Huh? I mean, you can feel it. Okay, now, you two?
Yeah, you first.
Not as a duetto, but individually.
We can go duetto as well. I have actually the question referring to the experience you just described, because I find it very problematic, this experience of presentification of the past, because you're speaking about making these past experiences present to actual again. But in how far can we speak about, well, authenticity is also a corrupt term, but still about the reality or about the how true is the experience of the past? Because it's all the medievalist scientists, people who study medieval cultures know that the way we are from contemporary point of view trying to assess the medieval culture is totally corrupt. We cannot, we only speak about the experience, oh, how we would experience this and that. We're totally deprived of the enough cultural material surrounding to imagine how possibly we can perceive particular objects of that culture.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit hysterical. Huh? I mean, yes, of course, we can never be certain, and it is always approximative. I mean, asymptotic. I mean, you don't fully get there. But I mean, I'm just preparing, not yet ready, with a talk about medieval culture as presence culture that I'm supposed to give in Bern in 2 days at your university. I mean, we do know quite a lot about the Middle Ages. We certainly know more in that sense than 50 years ago. And I almost started, I mean, I started like 45 years ago as a medievalist. You can, of course, never be certain about that. And this is why I'm saying that for me, this effect of pre-identification is an aesthetic effect. Yeah? I mean, some of you may know that I wrote this book in 1926, when I didn't have a concept of Stimmung yet. But this book basically is an experiment of how far you can go with a text in allowing your readers to immerse themselves into a historical situation that is quite remote. I mean, 1926 is now 90 years ago. Now, what do you gain from that? I'd say hardly anything, unless you like doing that. Yeah, and once you like doing that, you can then, of course, constantly say in a deconstructive attitude, but it is not the real otherness. And that's fine, but as we're talking about aesthetic experience, I would not like to go so far as for it to spoil my pleasure. Yeah? I mean, so it is something from far away that I try to make present, and by trying to make it present, I can use as an object of immersion. You don't learn anything from that. You are right. That is never fully possible, never 100% possible. But I don't know. I mean, depends on you. Do you ever have such moments?
Of this encounter
Yeah.
with something.
Yeah, but it can be culturally remote, can be chronologically remote, whatever. Not wow. This is. Yeah, I mean, I have them. I mean, normally they don't help you with your life. Yeah? I mean, don't make you earn more money or solve problems in your family or anything like that. But I think they're very precious. I mean, I like them, and I think they, in principle, they can of course be chronologically remote and culturally typologically remote. But you are not quite happy with my answer.
Yeah, just maybe I give you this answer because my question derived from a very strong impression, again, from this medieval department in Bern, where I took a couple of classes about the literature, medieval literature, and which were assessed from different points of view and from the discourse analysis, but which also focused on the senses and the experience, in very much this everyday quotidian experiences. And all in all of these efforts of academics back there were made to make us believe that it's totally impossible, and we are very naive if we believe that we can get even the remote understanding of what that experience
Yeah, I
would
mean,
be.
of course, if you make this assumption, you're always on the safe side, right? I mean, you don't make any strong claims. I mean, as I was saying, this specific experience I would ultimately label as aesthetic experience. I can say, as long as you have this effect of presentification, that's good for you. Yeah, you don't have to, I mean, I also feel, you do not have to constantly revise itself. I mean, it's like when you watch a historical movie, right? I mean, yet another token of my bad taste is that I'm completely addicted to The Godfather. I mean, the 3 parts of The Godfather. And I absolutely like to feel, I mean, when I see the first scene, the first wedding scene, this was New York in 1945. And you see these old cars, or you see the opening of the second part with the first communion of Michael Corleone's son, right? And Lake Tahoe, close to where I'm living. So, oh my God, this was in the 1960s. You can, of course, A, say, oh, there are lots of mistakes. And you can B, say, it is not really possible. But when I'm saying presentification, I'm of course not claiming that this is fully possible. Right? I'm using a metaphor that people in the early Middle Ages and other cultures were using to make things present again, to conjure up. But ultimately, this feeling that you can conjure up something chronologically or culturally remote is, of course, I mean, the full sense is an illusion, but you can come closer than some others. And you?
Yes, thank you. My question is connected with your explanation of the otherness. As I understand, Stimmung is always experience of alternity, and at the same time it comes from inside of every of us, so it is connected also to our bodies, yes, to existential presence, which is completely individual. So my question is, does the Stimmung which we experience is personal, is specific for every of us, or can the question of some intersubjectivity be raised connected to Stimmung?
I mean, I would maybe not like to say intersubjectivity, but something that's also an English word doesn't exist, a sharedness. Yeah, I mean, things are being shared. I mean, there are clearly such situations. I mean, I've written in another book, it's called After 1945, Latency as Origin of the Present. I've been trying to describe in Europe, above all, the 1950s. I mean, these are the First, I was born in 48. These are the first days that I can remember. I read material and I tried as best I can to describe the situation and make it possible to conjure up this situation. I think that is possible to a certain degree. I mean, this is a writerly question. I mean, how do you write that? Yeah, if you constantly undercut and say, oh, it's not, in reality it's not possible, then it will never happen.
The question is also if some people perceive, feel, experience some, let's say, the same Stimmung or similar Stimmung, like the Titanic situation, for example. How can they share it with words, with language? Is it possible to articulate what Stimmung would you experience now?
I mean, as we all know, that is possible, and then you feel, oh, you know, I agree with the other person, or you feel, well, I don't quite agree, but it must have been the same situation, or sometimes you think, how can he possibly have felt this in such a wrong way, as if there was wrong or right? I mean, yeah, what can I say? Give me a question again.
Again.
Yeah.
Again, yes.
The
last one was about language. Is it possible to articulate the Stimmung, or it's completely connected to irrational sides of us?
No, it's not necessarily irrational. I think you could say it has a complexity, or it is sublime. I mean, as Kant would have said, in a way that will always exceed language. Yeah? Which doesn't mean that you could not even make the effort. Yeah? So, you know, I'm desperately trying in this Janis Joplin chapter to describe my reaction. I mean, my Stimmung triggered by that song, I mean, I get only so and so far. Yeah, I'm not pretending that I can ever completely do that. I'm also by no means pretending that you are obliged or should feel the same way. I mean, this is just what I feel about it. And to go the other way around, I mean, instead of describing it, I do that more and more in my teaching, you can also simply point to it. Yeah? So instead of interpreting or analyzing or whatever you want to call what I did, me and Bobby McGee, you can just play it in your class and tell your students one or two anecdotes about how important that was to you in a certain point of your life. You get my point? I mean, this deictic effort, look how good that is. I mean, why don't you give yourself a chance and look to some early Beethoven symphony, for example, I mean, this deictic gesture, I think, is much more related to the epiphanic quality of saying, oh my God, I get it, I get the Stimmung, than a long interpretative discourse.
You hope for those people give the similar Stimmung at least. And there's always some gap. Okay.
Yeah, and that they have this kind of epiphanic moment, right? I mean, that, oh my God, now, but we oftentimes say, now I get it. Yeah, so somebody has told you about a poem or about a painting, and you listen to it, or you read it, or you see it for the first time, and say, yeah, it's okay, but I mean, what's the big deal? And all of a sudden you get into it, and then you have a very hard time then you become almost addicted, And I think in our, not only academic teaching, this type of aesthetic experience, so to speak, I mean this type of making you capable of aesthetic experience is not sufficiently used, because we constantly have to interpret and say, was der Text uns sagen will, what the text wants to say to us.
So
it's a real seminar. Pretty much everybody has a question.
Probably I'll continue the theme of the previous question. In your opinion, is the latent independent from the perceiver? Because, well, for example, the works by Umberto Eco, like Foucault's Pendulum, like Named Rose, which are meant to be perceived from different perspectives, like for example like a historical book or a philosophical essay, but there is still works that for example, are not meant to have any specific
Yeah, I get it.
value, like,
yeah.
for example, postmodernistic literature at times, and people at the same time still find something latent in them, like some kind of a value that was not meant by the author. So,
I mean, you can always, of course, say that how somebody specifically resonates with something, with the music. I mean, there are no two persons in the world who react in the exact same way to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, you could say. Yeah? I mean, you could push that. I mean, you can write 10,000 at some point. So, in your resonance with something, or in your reaction with something, there's always one dimension or one part depending on your individuality and your prehistory and what you have read, on your body shape, God knows what. You can then secondly say in general, I mean that's a long question, and I've just had a long discussion about that with one of my best friends at Stanford, that the world does not exist before somebody perceives the world. The world does not exist before somebody perceives the world. I mean, like this idea that there were no humans or no intelligent beings in the universe, say, okay, would the universe still exist? And not in the material sense, but would you call it a world if nobody ever perceives it, right? I mean, this would be a second question. Ultimately, however, and this goes back to this first thing, whatever we call Stimmung is triggered by the lightest touch, blah, 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 blah. Ultimately, I'm making an argument in favor of an objectivistic understanding of Stimmung. Yeah? So I think if there's nothing there, then there's no Stimmung. So if you only imagine that it will get hot or cold or humid or whatever, you can, of course, we all know that, psychologically get yourself into that, but that's not what I would call Stimmung.
so we may imply that latent is preceding the Stimmung. Like it precedes it.
Yeah. I mean, at least logically, it doesn't, I mean, actually, it doesn't necessarily have to precede the Stimmung, can be in the sense, from the moment on that there is a situation of latency, the Stimmung is around, you could say. Yeah? So in that sense, it doesn't have to precede it, but logically, I mean, you could say, yes, the latency is the cause for certain Stimmung. Not always, I'm not saying every latency does that. And I'm also not saying that every Stimmung leads you back to a latency, but oftentimes it goes this way.
I was impressed by this accent on body, on this somatic experience of literature, of any art that you mentioned. And I thought of this thing that maybe you can say that literature, art, they take part of something in the real world, yes? But
Absolutely.
as we know, there was no written literature before some time,
Yes.
and after it
In
there
the
was
West.
written literature, and after it there was printed literature, and now 99% of literature that we perceive is read but not heard, and later 99% of music that we listen is played from the recording but not heard as a song or playing live. And possibly I can say that when I sit at home I see hundreds of photos of people on Facebook, but I see much less real persons that same day. So the question is, there are some examples of how people make an effort to return these like mediums to the real world. For example, my favorite is about Cento Canti, this 100 Songs, a society in Italy of Dante's lovers. Everybody in this society knows at least one song by heart, and they encounter sometimes, I don't know, in Florence, and from the dawn until the sunset, they recite the Divine Comedy. And of course, they gather the crowd to hear it, and it's maybe one of the examples of how the crowd can be not violent, not fascist.
That's very beautiful.
But,
self-affectation, you call it.
Yes, because in the medieval era, people didn't read Dante in the book.
You know?
They told it to each other. But the question is, do you have any hope of overcoming this process of like digitalization of everything, or such examples are only like?
I mean, look,
some
it's not so completely out of hope. I was mentioning briefly the fact that, okay, so this is again the sports example, but this public viewing, nobody had even anticipated it 10 years ago. See, when I was your age, and it might do apologies to all of those who are not interested in sports, but this is not about sports. When I was your age, it was said if you ever broadcast soccer games at the same time that they take place in the stadium, stadiums will be empty. It was actually until very recently, on a Saturday of Bundesliga, of German first league soccer, TV was not allowed to feature any game before 6:30 p.m. Because they had this fear from the 70s. Today we know it's the other way around. I mean, the more people hear on the radio or watch on TV or watch live stream, the more people are in the stadium. And my guess is, and there I'm coming in, that the status of life experience, the status of the objective experience is very, very different in a world where we spend most of our time in a fusion of software and consciousness. Right? So I'm not saying presentification becomes easier. In that sense, you're right. And yes, presentification will never be full. And you can always say the impression of a plenitude of identification is an illusion. But you could ask back, so what would be then the reality? Yeah, I mean, as opposed to the illusion. And you can say B, that would ask from the aesthetic point of view, why are you doing that to yourself? You know, I mean, so if you get a kick out of a situation of presentification, let's say, yeah, okay, has anybody of you ever heard the first recording of the Soviet national anthem that was commissioned by Stalin when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union? And the first recording is a performance of the Russian national anthem, which I think is very beautiful anyway, by the Red Army Choir. And maybe it is only when you know, but I mean, it's actually, I'm obsessed with it and I hear it like, well, 3 times per week or so. You think you somehow feel that the persons who are singing that believe that the likelihood is that they will die and their country will disappear from the map within the next 6 months. Yeah? No, it's absolutely impressive. In that case, of course, it helps that we know that wasn't the case. But yet, I mean, like with Sappho and Fragment 34, there is something very precious about this moment that is not in the realm of the cognitive. Doesn't make me understand World War II better or something like that. It makes something present, and this making something present makes my life richer. I mean, I was saying that half to Sasha also. It is true, of course. You could always say that's not the real thing, but it is darn close, as you would say in Californian English. Any further questions? Yeah, now we have so many questions that almost everybody has asked a question.
Well,
and I feel like a good teacher.
well, your concept is quite rich in what it proposes to interpret. And like when you say about Stimmung, I think you mostly refer to like reading for Stimmung in a kind of sublime or humanities-based literary studies perspective, but I would also like to talk about more banal and everyday stuff like.
Can I before say that? No, I mean the
No
dominant way in the humanities is hermeneutic.
Mhm.
Yeah, you read for the plot, you read for the deep meaning, you read, as one would say in the 1960s, for the message, the political message of the author. All of that interests me little. I mean, I'd actually say this reading for the Stimmung is definitely not what dominates in the humanities worldwide. I mean, a little book has had a certain impact, but not.
But you propose as a certain a new method.
Yeah.
But I would turn our attention to a whole market of mood regulating products, like and music and literature as well.
Sure.
Like recently I read in research of Ulrich of Japanese literature. That there is a whole genre like healing literature that has a certain type of writing and like using these kinesthetic and haptic triggers that should put you in a calm state and give you a space to think. So it's a whole market of these kinds of products, and it's also the same stuff happens, say, in music. Like a lot of people more and more now consume music not by following their favorite composers or artists, but by listening to playlists generated and compiled according to a certain mood or atmosphere. Like one German musician says that now that all the notes and beats are composed, written, we can work only in a realm of atmospheres. But what do you think, how this like huge, massive market of mood regulating literature,
Of what literature?
mood regulating literature, like this author Ulrich, he calls it ambient literature, like ambient music that gives you calm and healing. Like how does it connect with the literal studies and from that side that you look at things? Is it the same?
Yeah, okay. I mean, there are many things I could say about that. I mean, the first thing is that, I mean, the way I relate to literature is relatively old-fashioned. I mean, I relate to literature academically, I describe it, I identify things. I must be the only professor of literature who never in his life has been tempted to write literature. I mean, I've never had an interest in that, and I'm saying that because today, among colleagues that are younger than I am and among our students, there is a much more intense interest in getting close to what is happening in literature with literary criticism than it used to be the case in the olden days. So I think that these disciplines like musicology, art history, literature or literary history, they're all in a transformation in that sense, and I think partly this transformation, this would be terribly difficult to explain that, that historical experience as the experience of otherness seems to be largely level today. I mean, you feel it, I feel it, but this is because we're pretty sophisticated people. It sounds horrible to say that, but of course that's what we are sociologically speaking. Whereas, no, I mean, when I was a student, I mean, age of some of you, the primary reaction to a text on artwork was always historical. You made something historical, especially if you were a member of the Socialist Student Union, you had to do something historical with it because you had to learn from history and so forth and so forth. So today, that's the point I want to make, that is much less likely, and an aesthetic reaction, to texts from the past and to texts from the present, is more prevalent in a certain way. I mean, I didn't do that programmatically, but the book on Stimmung participates in that. I mean, you could say this is not only an instruction on how to get a kick out of reading this post by Walter von der Vogelweide, but in a way you already in that essay you begin the experience of that historical otherness. Get my point? I mean, what I want to say in general is that for historical reasons, aesthetic experience and aesthetic judgment are more in the foreground today than only a week ago. Really, I mean, it's increasing, and at the same time, and I'd never thought about it. Thanks to your question. At the same time, the fascination of this feeling of remoteness goes back. I give you one anecdote, maybe then I continue a little bit, or we just leave it here. So 2 or 3 years ago, I was teaching for a freshman class, and at an American university, it's a great honor that the president's office invites you to teach for the freshman class. And I was teaching another seminar, 20 lectures on what is a classic today? Question mark was the topic. I started by reciting, and it's in the book, a text that I enormously love, and that's Sonnet 18 by Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate, rough winds. I mean, some of you may know it, right? And as I'm not a native speaker, and okay, so I read that, and then my strategy had been that I wanted to say how remote this is. How remote this text is, how far away, and how far away the language of Shakespeare and everything. But as I'm not a native speaker, for some reason I had also not commented. Just came into the classroom, and there were 500, they split the freshman class in 3 groups, 500 people. Okay. So I read this, and I said, does any one of the native speakers, most students are of course native speakers, want to recite the poem? And I said that kind of knowing nobody would want to recite the poem. You remember the first 10 minutes of a very large class, nobody wants to speak, especially not if they're first year students. And lo and behold, more than 200 wanted to recite it. And I actually spent 2 hours letting them recite this very short poem. And most of them knew it by heart. But what I want to show here is that a fascination with historical otherness that is very crucial for me, and seemingly given you a question before, Tatiana, for you, is kind of disappearing, but I don't think it's the end of the world. Yeah, I mean, I think our relationship to the past is changing. All of a sudden, something that since the late 18th century we thought was forbidden and impossible, namely we are developing increasingly an aesthetic relationship with the past. Yeah, if you want to, I can explain you what I mean. Is that clear what I'm saying? So I mean, they get a kick out of reciting Sonnet 18, and if you ask them why is it, because it sounds so beautiful, because like many great poems, the content is completely banal. I mean, the content is how sad it is that this young man, the beauty of this young man whom I'm madly in love with, will fade like anything fades. I mean, nobody would read Sonnet 18 because of this message, right? Would one? No. You would read Sonnet 18 because, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely, more because of the prosody. Get my point? So this is coming in the foreground. And I'm just observing that. Yeah? But you look at me like I'm crazy. I mean, I'm trying to observe something that is happening in our present intellectually, and it's a little bit like what I was saying about electronic technology. It's neither good nor bad. It's changing, and it's interesting to think about it.
It's very fluid phenomena.
Yeah. I mean, like, just one more remark. I mean, I don't know whether they agree with me, but I mean, nobody in her or his mind today believes that we can really learn from the past. I mean, you can make analogies, you can be cultivating an argument, but this kind of, the way that Hegel and people throughout the 19th century before Nietzsche believed that one can learn from the past, I mean, if somebody really does that today, you immediately send them to a psychiatric emergency care. Yeah? I mean, if somebody shows me somebody who invests money based on historical experience, then I will believe in the Lord. Nobody today does that, and we know that 50 years ago people did that. Okay, sorry.
I was very intrigued by your notion of this mystic body.
Mm-hmm.
And, as far as I understand now,
Yeah.
let's put it in form of question. May one say that mystic body, it's about a community of people who share a certain Stimmung? And if so, just let me continue, if so, may we apply to this mystic body the same quotation to be touched from inside your body, in this case, this mystic body of the community?
Okay. So if you allow me, I want to, it's strange, it's a seminar. I mean, I cannot do much more than 20 minutes because A, I'm tired, and B, I have to get up tomorrow morning at 4:30.
Yeah, sure.
And I have a dinner promise. Okay. Is that okay with you? I mean, I'm not finishing now, but I want to react to that because I think it's a very, very important question. It also combines the two things. I felt in the first part I didn't have enough time for the mystical, I say mystical body.
Mm-hmm.
So let me just, it doesn't matter, I mean, just clarify. Remember, was everybody in the lecture? I mean, not that you have to, but, okay. So I'm using the concept mystical body to avoid the concept crowd or mass, right? Because those concepts have so heavy negative connotations for good reasons, you know. There's always this wall there, with euthanasia that I had in the room. I mean, it's perfectly understandable. Mystical body is the oldest self-description of Christianity. The very early 3rd century church calls itself Christ's mystical body. And as Christ is the embodiment of God on earth, the self-description of the church as mystical body includes the bodies of the Christians. Yeah? This is not a party where people have shared interests or social class where people live under similar conditions of production and have shared interests. No, this includes the body. Okay, so this is why I'm saying mystical body. I mean secular mystical body. I have no association with it. Now, I've never thought this idea, Tatiana, but I think the idea is very, very beautiful to say. I mean, remember, this one assignment, I said this would be a typical question where the humanities would come in. It's not the only question, but is there a way not only to create a more positive concept of mystical bodies, but is there a way to let people gather around the Brandenburg Gate and to make it somehow a good experience and also to isolate dangers, okay? That would be okay. Now,
it's some concept.
Yeah. No, I come actually with music, but with the stadium at the same time. So, according to, remember, objectivity of Stimmung, according to my proposal of understanding the concept of Stimmung, of course you can define it in a different way, there cannot be any Stimmung without a body being there. I mean, if your self-reference is in the tradition of subject, capital S, Cartesian subject, you cannot have a Stimmung. You need to be Dasein, don't have to use the Heideggerian, but you have to have a body in order to have a Stimmung. Yeah? Is that clear? Now, a crowd, a mass, a mystical body, always says, I didn't even say collective bodies, it's a gathering of bodies, and they are capable of feeling a Stimmung. Okay, and now I come with my example that is so beautiful that I always get kind of tears in my eyes when I'm telling it, and it doesn't go. The more I tell it, the more I get tears in my eyes, and it's about my favorite soccer team. My favorite soccer team, I mean, I wish it was about my favorite American football team, but it happens to be a soccer story. My favorite soccer team for the soccer fans is Borussia Dortmund. Huh? You know, does anybody know Borussia Dortmund? Good taste. Borussia Dortmund has a huge, kind of ugly stadium with 86,000 people. It's always full. I mean, even if they play horrible bit, which they normally don't, of course, it's full. And it's an asymmetrical stadium. It's the only stadium in Germany that has a very large standing only stand. Yeah? It's called the Yellow Wall. There are 33,000 people standing. And the tickets are very cheap, and there's pressure from the German league to transform into more expensive tickets. They're very faithful because it's a proletarian region. Okay, that's called the Yellow Wall. And the Yellow Wall normally completely supports the team throughout the game, and this is why I love to be there. I was actually guest of honor in the stadium of Dortmund in April, and I said the manager of the club said, oh, where do you want to sit, Herr Professor, in the VIP zone? I said, above all, not in the freaking VIP zone. I want to stand in the yellow wall. And then he said in German, das ist zu gefährlich für Sie, Herr Professor. So I was not allowed to sit one anyway. And the yellow wall has adopted from, for those among you who know about soccer, from Liverpool. There's this song that Liverpool fans sing at the end of the game, "You Never Walk Alone." And for some reason, I didn't even know it, the Dortmund crowd, with a very heavy German accent, they also sing, you never walk alone. Yeah, but they sing it. Okay. So there was a home game was relatively irrelevant against Mainz 05, and Dortmund was leading 2-0 at halftime. And there's the halftime, and the first half had been quite good. And then the second half, and the yellow wall is completely silent. And the commentators are nervous, the rest of the stadium is nervous because they normally go with the yellow wall. When they sing and when they shout, they shout. Even the ref is nervous, and the players were saying after the game they didn't know what happened. Have we played so poorly that they don't want to support us anymore, yeah? Or is there a scandal or something? Nobody knew what happened. Until 5 minutes before the game is over, it was seemingly exactly 5 minutes before the game is over, all of a sudden the entire yellow wall sings, "You Never Walk Alone," and then they all leave the stadium. So that when the game was over, the team normally goes to the yellow wall and says farewell and thanks for the support. There was no yellow wall. What had happened? During halftime, two of the people are always in the yellow wall. I don't know how they know about him. 2 people had died during that game, during the halftime, by heart attack. And the interesting thing is, that's the point I want to make, and talk of Stimmung, literally. There was clearly no conductor. So there was not an individual who was organizing that. Yeah, or would stand in front of them and said, with 5 minutes, we all sing "You Never Walk Alone."
Let's do it. Yes.
Yeah. So this was actually, I don't know whether anybody read about it. It was all over the world press, even in the US, where nobody cares about soccer, which I like. But it was, and also not only in sports sections. What a phenomenon! So that would be a beautiful example. I had never thought about it. But I would now use the concept of Stimmung, and I would use the concept of Stimmung. I mean, I'm not going to educate the yellow wall, but what I can do is to produce a more respectful, that would be the word, a more respectful concept of crowds. A more respectful concept of crowds. I mean, if you want me to go one step further, I think it is impossible to eliminate the danger of violence if you have crowds. But that's a different question. I think it's maybe also dangerous to eliminate violence from human life completely, and that's a dangerous illusion. But on the other hand, a crowd based on Stimmung is capable, or a mystical body, to produce such a profoundly moving moment that an individual would not be able to produce. That would be very different, because if that happens with an individual, it's Sasha or me who decides to sing "You Never Walk Alone," and it can be very, very beautiful. But it's completely different from 33,000 people doing that without an agent. It has something, I would say telluric.
Miracle.
Miracle, but also something that gets to your guts. I mean,
Telluric.
Telluric. I mean. You get my point. I mean, the concept of Stimmung that I try to develop, I mean, one thing is the book and another thing is where I want to go, would perfectly fit in this point. And as the next book that I'm going to write, when I finish this book, I'm now finishing a book on Diderot, Goya, Lichtenberg and Mozart. Next project I have is something like, it sounds a little bit shallow, an intellectual rehabilitation of crowds. That's the next book I want to write. But it's not. It is also, I don't know, now I'm logorrheic. I mean, talk. It is also a book that talks about white trash. Yeah? I mean, I think it's a national and international disaster that Trump got elected. But this was also an election where, for the first time, the people have spoken.
on Stimmung.
Yeah, and I think we have no clue what for those 30 million white trash Americans a good life would be, and we should know. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying they get all we send them all to Dortmund and then they become transformed into good persons, but you get my point. I mean, this is not, I mean, the intellectual rehabilitation of crowds is not meant to be a book about soccer or American football crowds. It is meant to address this problem also as a contemporary political problem, because I think we would not talk about this topic if it was just about soccer crowds or
Yeah, sure.
ice skating crowds or hockey crowds. Hockey is my second favorite sport, so before soccer.